about ready? All right.
Okay.
Go for it.
So we've heard now 2 different presentations about creativity in the design process, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So we're going to talk about Little Bets by Peter Sims, which is a book about experimental innovation and ways to come up with, use this creative process to come up with better ideas. So his theory is that most successful entrepreneurs do not begin with brilliant ideas. They just don't. We talked about this a little bit earlier. It's sort of hard to make that big leap and sort of go to space without the intermediate steps. So he instead thinks that they discover them through experimentation and taking small risks, trying something that they're not sure is going to work, and dealing with the consequences and seeing what happens. And sort of tied in with that is this idea that there's 2 kinds of innovators. We've got conceptual innovators, like Mozart here in the picture, who really are the sort of traditional definition of genius. They come up with new ideas and they have breakthroughs early in life. And no one taught them how to do what they're doing. They're just gifted. And you may think that you can be like them, but it's kind of hard. And then we've got experimental innovators, which use iterative trial and error approaches to gradually build up to breakthroughs and deal with failure and persist at problems even after failing. And Peter Sims thinks that anyone can be an experimental innovator, and if you use the approach that we're going to talk about in Little Bets, anyone can get there. And just before I move on, I'd like to talk a little bit. We've got these key takeaways at the bottom of the slide, so if you get bored and don't want to read all of it, we've picked out what we think is the most important pieces of some of the slides to help you get a little bit more information from the presentation. So the Little Bets framework in sort of how anyone can become an experimental innovator has 5 pieces: experiment, play, immerse, define, and reorient. And I'm going to just move right on to experiment because they don't make a lot of sense without explanation. So first, experimenting with Little Bets, and this is really where the name of the book comes from, is using concrete actions to test and discover ideas. And the key point in this is they need to be both achievable and affordable. So even if you don't think it's a plausible idea, if you can test it, it counts as a little bet. You need to be able to try it out. Just having a sort of big idea that you can't try doesn't work with this. But there are creative possibilities that you can refine over time. And these are especially helpful in uncertain scenarios where you might not know what the answer is or even how to get there, but you know some part of the problem, and you can work from there and try little pieces. And a key portion of sort of the experiment branch of the Little Bets framework is being comfortable with failure and affordable loss. So instead of focusing on the millions of dollars you're going to make when your startup is successful, you should instead focus on, well, how much money are you willing to lose, or time, or resources to try your little bets, because that's how you know that they're concrete bets that you're willing to do, and also that you're willing to deal with them if they fail. And this also makes failure both sort of inevitable, which Peter Sims thinks is a good thing, and makes it undesirable to play it safe. Because you're never going to get to that new innovation if you're afraid to take another step. And so this can lead to more creative solutions that you might get if you were afraid of what was going to happen next. And I've got a little example for you. So the HP25 handheld calculator was the first handheld calculator. It retailed for $400 in 1972. That was a lot of money. And there wasn't a market for it. Traditional market research said, don't sell it. HP asked, and that was the answer they got. And HP said, well, let's make 1,000 and see if we can sell them and just see what happens. We're willing to have them rot in a warehouse and not get that money back in manufacturing. So they took that affordable bet, that affordable loss, and it turned out that there was a market for handheld calculators, and pretty soon they were selling far more than they could manufacture. And it turned out that they had created the handheld calculator market. And they wouldn't really have known that unless they had tried it, experimented, like Peter Sims is suggesting in his framework. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Scott to talk about the next piece of the framework.
Sure. So the next piece of the framework is called play, and this can be broken down to 3 different steps. The first is facilitating experimentation. Now, playfulness only occurs in an open environment. I'm sure you guys have worked in a group where there are several people, and you're afraid, someone might be smarter, someone has a better idea. However, the best ideas don't come to fruition by people doubting themselves and not really putting forth any idea that comes to mind. A productive brainstorming session really is the most productive when everyone can just not be afraid to be judged and whatnot. So the best thing to do for the best ideas is to make sure that everybody feels comfortable enough to say anything that they want, and even talk about an idea that comes to mind right away. We grow up hearing there's no such thing as a stupid question. In this sense, much in the same light, Sims says that he wants people to work in an environment where there's no such thing as a dumb idea. One thing that he brings up is this idea of the hippo dominating the conversation, and that's an acronym for the highest paid person's opinion. You do not want that person, their opinion, to dominate the conversation, or for that to intimidate others from giving forth their ideas. The next step in play is to build up ideas in groups. However, in order to foster this welcoming environment, you can do it in one of 2 ways. The first is introducing humor, which is often, sometimes nice from coming from the hippo, or somebody in a higher level position. You can introduce a joke. It kind of puts people at ease and allows them to feel comfortable in contributing their thoughts. Another way is plussing, which we saw in the IDEO case, as well as in different examples as far as Disney's Pixar movies or in Saturday Night Live. What plussing is essentially putting everything out on the table when you're working in a group, and not passing judgment right away, but instead giving feedback and improving those ideas instead of shutting them down completely right away. And the last part of play is to determine reactions. So we have one example, such as comedians. You see Chris Rock and Louis C.K. up on the screen, and these 2 people, they'll go to smaller nightclubs in New York or Los Angeles, and they'll give their shows before they end up putting them on Comedy Central or HBO. And this is primarily so they can judge reaction and see, how the audience reacts. To make sure that they can revise their jokes and whatnot and see how the audience takes them before bringing them to a bigger stage. This is their way of playing. So this transitions nicely into Immerse, which was essentially inspired by Eric von Hippel, who is a professor at MIT Sloan School of Management. Now his idea, he was actually the first person to say that new product innovations are more thought of by consumers rather than suppliers, and so he really took this and ran with it. So his idea essentially helps answer the question, how do insights from early adopters help drive idea development? Now there are several names for these kinds of users that he tries to tap into, active, lead, or extreme, and essentially they're just an incredible resource for developing any new product or idea. And active users are ideal because their unique ideas and needs often foreshadow those of people in the future who might not be thinking of this product at the time. So their ideas essentially account for at least 75 or up to 85% of new product innovations. 2 examples. The first is musician John Legend. When he's recording songs, he will create background music first. He will then add a melody on top and then write lyrics. However, it's a very collaborative process. So he essentially will ask people like Kanye West or other industry experts their feedback and work in this collaborative environment to make sure that he's getting all the feedback from people as he's writing his songs to help perfect them. So essentially Kanye West acts as his active user in this case. The second example is Procter & Gamble. They have a global open innovation approach where they tap into active users, people at home, consumers, stay-at-home moms and dads and whatnot who use their products the most to solicit feedback and then make necessary improvements before putting them to the general market. The last thing about Immerse is that it's really difficult to find active users. They're very rare because they're not essentially experts by traditional standards. It's not like you have a PhD in new product innovation or whatnot. Oftentimes they're people who don't have degrees or whatnot, but they're just the best consumers, or people who are constantly thinking about this, or those certain ideas. But they are around us. I think it's just, Sim says that it's just tapping into them and finding them, being proactive in the workplace. So then I'll pass it on to Yasha here.
So the first half of Little Bets is pretty much like, how can we come up with new ideas? How can we come up with creative ideas? But, as we've seen in like previous idea cases, when you stick up the ideas in the wall, you're flooded. So what do we do to kind of simmer down, bring down the best, the brightest, the smartest ideas out? And that's, defining what your constraints are. So with the Disney Hall, for instance, they wanted a hall that could play orchestra, they could play different concerts at, but it could have been anything. You could imagine a million possibilities, infinite possibilities of how a hall should look like. So the only constraint that they put on, one of the only constraints that they put on, money wasn't a constraint for the Disney Hall. One of the biggest constraints was we want it to sound great. We want it to be the best music hall acoustically. So, adding one constraint chops down all the possibilities that are outside of like a single constraint, and they keep adding more and more. So if you add more constraints to yourself, you're going to boil down to an idea that's probably your best solution. And the second thing is, tackling a problem by itself may not be the best way of solving something if it's very complex. So the Descartes method that's, circa 1600s, Descartes proposed that you break down any large problem into smaller problems and then solve each small problem by itself. The Little Bets kind of works upon this framework by, saying, take each product, iterate each smaller product within that product, and then you can come up with something grand. Breaking down these products will help guide your progression through the system. What will happen is if you want to invent a bicycle that's better than all the other bicycles, you fix the wheel first, you fix the gears, you fix the frame, and then eventually you have something that's great. So, after you define your problem, you also kind of want to reorient yourself. You want to make sure that you're on the right path. They say, don't turn a molehill into a mountain, but if you stay on the mountain, you might lose your path. So start tackling the molehills first. Pixar is a great example. The guys at Pixar originally wanted to do full feature films. They wanted to do stuff like Toy Story, Monsters, Inc. But if you don't have the capital, how can you just like jump into full feature film? So they started doing shorts, and a lot of the Pixar shorts actually started trailing into like a full Disney movie, like The Lion King had a Pixar short. So start doing like those small problems first. Start taking care of the molehills. The mountains will be taken care of later. And the second thing is you should reorient yourself to your situation. Believe it or not, Pixar was actually a hardware company before they actually started making movies. They were focused on building hardware for graphics animation and very high performance graphics. But their computers were about $40,000 a piece. So, something that expensive wasn't really selling. So they decided, well, we have this amazing hardware, but no one wants to buy it. So what do we do with hardware? Well, we can start actually using it for animation ourselves and come up with some great movies. Steve Jobs wanted to pull the plug on Pixar. He was one of the founding investors. And until they started churning out some really cool shorts, no one really believed in Pixar. And I'm going to actually play a quick clip of the first Pixar short. So if any of you guys remember this, this was in The Lion King actually, the beginning of The Lion King.
And this was really revolutionary for the time. Did you say this took about 4 days to
So it took about 4 days to render this video, even though it's like a 2-minute video. So your computer right now could do this, pretty quickly, like at least real time.
But this was one of the molehills that they had to get through in order to create those full-length feature films.
Exactly.
Both from a capital standpoint and just from a technology standpoint. The computers couldn't really do it at the time, and they could handle this and not much longer. And this isn't that much different in quality than what they put out now.
And this came out in 1986, like when they first started developing this rendering engine. So it took a few years to get it over to like Lion King status, but you can see this is pretty amazing for something that was pre-90s. That's it?
All right, thank you very much. If you really have to leave, go ahead and do so now. You can grade them later on YouTube, but I'd appreciate if everybody possible could stay. This is the last one.